I love taking risk. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it leads to opportunity. If I didn't take risk, not only would I not be a business continuity consultant, I wouldn't be in this field at all. I took a huge risk to get into this field, had no business being there, and that's just for better or worse, I guess, how I live large aspects of my life.
Learning to swim is about learning from others. Be the author of your own story, not a character in somebody else's story. Get inspired by others to take action. Learn how to set goals to exceed your own expectations. So often the answer that you are looking for is right in front of you. On Learning to Swim, we highlight those answers through storytelling. Good morning, James.
Good morning, Kristan. How are you?
I am doing well. I'm so excited that you are going to be talking with us on Learning to Swim this morning. Morning for me, afternoon for you. Before we jump in, I do want to do a quick introduction of James. So James Green is the Director of Risk Advisory Services at SAI Global. So you've worked on risk events that have occurred all over the world, everything from civil unrest in Egypt during the Arab Spring to typhoons in the Pacific Rim. And you hold multiple risk management certifications. You are a sought after speaker on the topics of resilience and workplace violence. And in 2020, you were named the Business Continuity Institute's Continuity and Resilience Consultant of the Americas, becoming the first person to be honored with this award twice. So congratulations. That's something.
Thank you so much. When you say all of that, that actually sounds impressive, like I've done something. So I appreciate that introduction.
Oh my goodness. Well, I can attest to the fact that you have for sure done something. And when we were talking last week, you had mentioned, for instance, that we are now, just to give some context to where we're in 2020. We are in the midst of a global pandemic and civil unrest within the United States, and we've got a pending election. So there is a whole swirl of stuff happening right here, right now. And you were saying last year, remind me, you traveled like 190 days, did you tell me?
I was 150 days on the road last year on 4 continents. So
wow.
a little bit different this year. It's my mailbox, the grocery store, the pharmacy. That's about it this year. So
I know, right? Really, really different times that we're living in right now. So that is a perfect segue to my first question. And for all of you who are familiar with Learning to Swim, James agrees to be on Learning to Swim to share about his professional journey. We talk a lot about kind of having awareness around opportunities and kind of being spontaneous and maybe even taking a few risks or leaps of faith as you go along. But you have not, these questions are not something that you've been prepped on. So our first question is, what does resilience mean to you?
So at an organizational level, what it means to me, the term I use is that an organization can survive the next bump in the night. So when I work with organizations, I tell them there's always a next bump in the night, right? Like you said, just look at 2020. So much has happened this year. Most of us around the world forget that we started with catastrophic wildfires. Australia was burning. Right. And we've had a pandemic. We've had military flare-ups between the United States and North Korea and the United States and Iran. We've had civil unrest all over the world. We've had wildfires, you know, where you're located in California. There's so much has happened this year that I really preach that a lot of risk management is always about looking backwards and mitigating the last known risk. And for me, resilience is are you as an organization or as a family or as an individual, there's always that next bump in the night. Are you able to overcome it? Not perfectly, not smoothly, we're going to stumble, but are you still able to move forward? And that's, to me, that's the James Green definition of resilience.
Well, I love that. And I love in particular that it is a bump in the night, meaning the way that I interpret that is that it is, when you're in the dark and you are going to kind of struggle to see. And it's, and I think about the times when, you get woken up by the smoke alarm or whatever in the middle of the night, and it just is, without, and that's always why they talk about having some sort of plan and practicing for different events, because in the middle of the night you're not always at your sharpest, are you?
Exactly. And that seems to be, like you said, your smoke detector, your fire alarm never goes off Saturday at 10 a.m.
No.
It's always Tuesday at 3 in the morning. And in my field, it seems to be when the phone rings with bad news, it is always Tuesday at 3 in the morning. It's never Thursday at 2 in the afternoon. Absolutely.
Right. Well, in kind of going off of the idea of resilience, talk to me about, what does failure look like to you?
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of a failure right now globally, right? You're seeing organizations who can't adapt to a changing market, to a pandemic, or even a small incident. Like failure is just, for me, the inability to overcome any obstacle. It can be big or small. I was reading an article last month about a very small doctor's office, two doctors, like 3, 4 employees total. They got infected by ransomware, right? They couldn't
Mm-hmm.
afford to pay the ransomware. They didn't have the technical expertise to try and unwind it. They just closed their business.
Wow.
So, at a base level, that failure is, you can't overcome that bump in the night. And I think a secondary failure that we're seeing right now is, it's a competitive disadvantage. So if Kristan, if you and I have the same type of business, and we're seeing this right now play out with investors, and I'm struggling with my response to COVID-19 and you're not, you're creating an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
So also for me, that failure is the inability to have opportunity. So it's that opportunity cost. It's not just what you didn't do, it's what you couldn't even get to.
Right. Well, and how much, I, with other guests, they have brought forward the idea that, and you mentioned it in your definition of resilience, that it's not so much about doing things perfectly, right?
Correct. And that's really important. And I learned that early on. I was with an organization and the crisis management team had to come together, right? And they just had really one question to answer, and they wanted the perfect answer and the perfect response. So we got in the room together at 8:30 in the morning, didn't make a decision until 1 o'clock. So 4.5 hours trying to achieve perfection. And when you're making decisions during that bump of the night, it's going to be messy. You're not going to
Mm-hmm.
have all the information. Sometimes you're going to get erroneous information, but you have to act. So really in my profession, perfection is really dangerous. It's just something, if you wait for everything to happen, for all your ducks to get into a row, the incident's already over, or things have passed you by.
For sure. And I think a lot of the times when I'm talking with my clients, the one way that I kind of nudge them along is really to focus on kind of the next, just what does the next step look like, right? And so how do you work when, because you're working with, you're working globally, so
Mhm.
you have a lot of different, I'm sure, personalities and could be, cultural differences within that are because of the region of the world that you're working in. How do you kind of toggle between keeping that macro view, so being strategic in your planning, and also the micro view in kind of moving things along so that you don't get tripped up by perfection?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to focus on teamwork, right? And I know that sounds cliche, and what does that have to do with a crisis or a disaster? But you get a room of people, we're all in a room together. We're trying to make some type of decision. The first barrier I always find is the personality clashes.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes I've had to work with companies and say, hey, you need to remove this one person from the team, because if you and I don't get along, Kristen, in general, again,
Mm-hmm.
at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday when we're on a conference call, we're certainly not going to get along. So that's the first barrier. And then, yeah, like you said, working globally, you really have to be in tune to the mores and what happens in different situations, because as an American, right, there's a
Mm-hmm.
perception of Americans. And so they're already waiting, a lot of people, for you to be that guy. And so you
Right.
have to not be that guy, and you have to know what is acceptable, what is important. So the first time I was doing work in Honduras, every time you came into a meeting room, you shook everyone's hands, and you
Mm-hmm.
shook everyone's hands when they left. So you have to do that. I've worked in some countries where it's very hierarchical,
Mm-hmm.
right, and very rigid. So they will only, out of respect, answer a question that you ask. So if you don't ask the right questions, right? I learned this the hard way in
Mm-hmm.
Philippines when I was dealing with a typhoon, and I asked a question about I can't remember. I think it was, is the power on? And the answer was yes. There was no air conditioning in the building, but I didn't ask that question,
Right.
so that information wasn't volunteered to me. So just learning, I think that's a huge part of working globally, and it's something that Americans often overlook. And it's not because we're Americans, right? If you're in Germany, if you're raised in France, if you drive 4 hours, you're in another country.
Right.
So you have a lot of that international experience just taking road trips with your family. I'm in Tampa. If I drive 4 hours, I'm still in Florida. I haven't
Right.
even gotten out of the state yet. And if you drive north,
Oh my gosh.
forever. So
Forever.
I
Yes.
think it's really important for Americans or anyone who doesn't have that worldview. I always do some research first time on the ground with a country, and
Mm-hmm.
then first time in a company. All companies have a company
Right.
culture. And I think when you come in as a consultant or a third party, people overlook that. And I'm hyper focused on who's the players in the room. Is there someone who comes in the room when the conversation stops? And did it stop out of respect, or did it
Mm-hmm.
stop because they don't like that person? I need to
Mm-hmm.
have all those data sets if I'm going to work with you and your team. And so that's a large part of what I do is team building, because I learned early on in my career in business continuity that I was very focused on plans and documents, and then during an emergency those tend to go out the window 9 times out of
Right.
10. So
Right. And it is going to be, and even when you're in a perfect situation, it still is going to be the people who are tasked with carrying out these, I think it's great. I teach a lot about systems and structure, but at the end of the day, it does rely on, us, these incredibly fallible, humans with feelings
exactly.
and and all sorts of other things going on. Well, you've already touched on it, but I curiosity is something that I feel like is such an essential ingredient to success. at least in my path. And so how do you remain curious, and do you find, is that a valuable tool that you employ as you go into new engagements, or just as you go about your day to day?
Yeah, I think it's phenomenally important to be curious and to grow. So when I first transitioned from being a business continuity practitioner, just working for one company, to being a consultant, right? So I sought out, I was like, who's the person, who's the apex predator, who's the best consultant in our industry in the world? And I went up to this person at a conference. I introduced myself and said, hey, I just joined this company. I've been a consultant for a month. I was a practitioner, blah, blah, blah. Gave him my elevator pitch. I said, what advice do you have for me? And one of the cruelest things, honestly, ever said to me, this person said, my advice is for you to quit. And I was like, what? That's not the advice.
That's not what I thought you were going to say.
And this person said, practitioners are too rigid and make horrible consultants. You will never succeed as a consultant, and you should just quit and see if you get your job back. And we were at a conference. I went up to my hotel room. I'm not gonna lie, I just cried. I shut the door and I cried, and I was like,
oh yeah,
wow, that is not really what I was expecting. And so now fast forward a few years later, as you've mentioned, I've won some awards in recognition of my work. And I think a lot of that comes from being curious, always wanting to learn, and I'm a problem solver. So when I first got in as a consultant, I was getting very generic, easy stuff. And as you know, sometimes you'll have a client or you'll have a project that nobody wants to do or nobody knows what to do with. And I always volunteered for those. So like I said, we had a client a couple years ago who was very unhappy, and they're like, we need someone in Central America, and no one wanted to go. And I raised my hand. I was like, yeah, I totally want to go. I want to spend some time, in these places I've never been. And that led to, just with that client, being in Asia, being in Central America. And then, of course, they had an office in Barbados. So when I got sent to Barbados, everyone's like, hey, wait a minute, how come
right.
James gets to go? And they're like, well, but that client, being in Central America, it helped reinforce, like, people have problems, and if you help solve them, if you empathize with what's going on, you're going to be successful. So a big thing there, right? It was during the World Cup or qualifying. Honduras had a match. I knew this. I made sure that day there was nothing scheduled during
Right.
during the match, because I knew everyone was going to be in the cafeteria watching. And if I would have scheduled a meeting, they would have taken it because people are polite. But you
Right.
all know they would have been thinking about that match.
Oh,
So it was just a
yeah.
little thing of being culturally aware, like, hey, we're gonna take lunch from 10 to 12 and watch the match. It really, like you said, you always have to remember, at the end of the day, you're still dealing with a person.
Yeah.
We're infallible. We have wants and needs. We have emotions. I always try to connect with you as Kristan first, and then let's build on all the, professional stuff.
Right. And I love what you mentioned about being that person that would raise their hand for those challenging assignments, because the way that I translate that is that you are creating your own opportunity there.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always been a huge risk taker. I love taking risk. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it leads to opportunity. If I didn't take risk, not only would I not be a business continuity consultant, I wouldn't be in this field at all. I took a huge risk to get into this field, had no business being there, and that's just, for better or worse, I guess, how I live large aspects of my life. So
Well, it seems like a nice segue. One of the things that I talk a lot about is our blind spots and our bright spots, and that they're essentially the same thing. You know, those things that we may not be aware of that we do that maybe hinder us, but maybe, you know, they also can be helpful. So what would be, if 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 I, you know, if I took a survey of, you know, a dozen of your friends, family, colleagues, what would they kind of universally say? Oh my gosh, James is so, he totally does this, and he's, you know, hands down, this is James. Like, what's a quality that you do?
well, any strength left unchecked becomes a weakness, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would
Mm-hmm.
think you would get a lot of in the range of confident to arrogant. Somewhere in that range is certainly going to be one of the characteristics. My wife is shaking her head off camera right now. So that's a yes. We got a yes and a laugh from my wife. So the thumbs up for that one. Now she's trying to ignore me.
Oh my
I think,
gosh. But to the point of it being, you know, where it can operate as a strength, right?
yeah,
Is you were saying when you started on this professional journey that, you know, you didn't necessarily, you know, you didn't check all the boxes that one would check. There was an amount of risk that you were
yeah. I
willing to
actually, if you want to hear the backstory, I actually didn't check any box when
take.
I got into business continuity.
Well,
So
I remember us talking about that. Yeah.
yeah, so
And
I had spent the first 10 years or so of my career in asset and portfolio management and technology equipment leasing companies. It was really kind of a boom or bust business model. So I worked for 4 companies, right? And 2 of them, the company got sold, everyone got laid off. And they were both at interesting times in my life. So the first time, my son was 2 months away. My first son was 2 months away from being born, and all of a sudden I was unemployed.
wow.
And the second time, we were getting ready to buy a house, and I was going to go and sign the offer letter that day at lunch when the president pulled the management team in and said, "Hey, we got sold, so you got to lay off everyone on your team." And that was right during the financial crisis, the meltdown of 2008, 2009.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, forget this. I don't like, even for a huge risk taker like me, the instability was too much.
Mm-hmm.
And a friend of mine worked for a large company, and he said, "Hey, we're looking for a new global head of business continuity." And I said, "So what does that mean?" And he said, "They were looking for candidates outside the box because we've gone through 4 people in 4 years."
Mm.
And I said, "Well, I'm outside the box because I don't even know what you're talking about." So I pushed out. I was like, "Okay, how late?" I said, "Let's meet in 3 weeks." And I spent 3 weeks like trying to solve their problem. What would James do? Why have the last 4 people failed, even though they were all professionals and
Right.
experts in their field? How can I come save the day? Uh, and over a couple of days of interviews, I was like, I might actually get this job. I don't even understand what's going on here. I did get the job. I relocated from Jacksonville to Tampa, and I was so sure, Kristen, that I was going to get fired that I didn't buy a house. I didn't even sign a long-term lease. I signed like a 6-month lease on an apartment because I'm like, well, they're going to quickly figure out, like I've been telling them all along, I don't know what I'm doing, and
Right.
then they'll fire me, but at least I'll have some income for a couple of months. And that was 10 years ago. And now, business continuity is my passion.
Right.
So taking that risk, uh, being confident, bleeding to the point of arrogance of, I always, when I mentor people, I say, if you're interviewing for a job, they feel you belong in the room, right?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody looked
Right.
at your resume or your CV or talked to you and said, you belong in this room.
Mm-hmm.
So once you get in that room, don't lie, don't exaggerate, but don't doubt yourself. They've already said you belong here. And
Right.
then just, kind of run with it from there. And that's served me, I think, pretty well. So
I think that's excellent advice. So if the confidence bordering on arrogance at times is something that is kind of the something you're known for, what would be a less, maybe more of a hidden talent or a less obvious talent that you have that you'd be willing to share?
um so I think I'm very situationally aware of people.
Mm-hmm.
So people meet me and they're like, wow, that guy's confident or arrogant. And I read a lot, so I'm intelligent and well versed. And people maybe see some of those hard skills and don't realize that I spend a great amount of my time, like I said, trying to connect and understand people. And that
Mm-hmm.
has served me really well the last few years is when I sit down with a potential client, I'm not thinking about selling you something, or I'm just like, okay, what's your pain point?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's maybe something that people who takes a while to get to know me, that I am actually very focused on, people's emotions and stressors. So
Yeah. Oh, that's excellent. So if I'm always curious about what people's very, very first job was. So like as a kid, what was a task or a job? I mean, something where you actually got paid for it.
yeah, absolutely. So I was born and raised in the Detroit area, suburbs of Detroit, and in 8th grade, the class trip was Washington, D.C.
Hmm.
So that's like that's a whole nother, you're leaving the state.
Right.
And at the time, living with my mom, single mom, she was going to college, right?
Hmm.
Going back to school after being a stay-at-home mom for 20 years. So discretionary funding was not available.
Right.
And so she said, so if you want to go on this trip, you need to help pay for it. So I got totally cliched, and your younger audience is going to think I'm 150 years old, but I got a paper route, and it was one
Nice.
of those. It wasn't a big paper. It was I want to say it was like the Oakland County Observer and Gazette, maybe. Don't quote me on that, but it was a twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday. I had to deliver papers and collect routes and stuff like that. So that
Hmm.
was my first like job where I had a paycheck. So
That's awesome. And so how, if any way, how does that kind of connect to your current profession or your professional journey? um did that in have was that formative in some way?
I think it was just, the responsibility. You're going to have responsibilities in life, and whatever pops up, you still have to meet them. So
Mm-hmm.
growing up in Michigan, if it was raining or snowing or 20 degrees out, or you hadn't seen the sun in a couple of weeks, it didn't matter. You had
Right.
to deliver those papers. I had no backup,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it was just like, it doesn't matter what's going on. You sometimes there's certain responsibilities where you have to overcome obstacles to finish them.
Yeah, and
So
just show up.
yeah, yeah, and sometimes that's half of it. Just show up.
Right,
So
exactly. Yeah, it's I find that I do really encourage. I have older kids, and there have been those moments in time where I I tell them it's like it's just in the showing up a lot of the times. And um, so yes, with a paper route, definitely it's all about the showing up. So you mentioned that you are an avid reader.
yes.
Would you, again, another little trip down memory lane, is what was a story that you really connected with, that either was told to you or that you read as a young person?
So everyone in my house was big readers, so it wasn't like an initiative I took on myself, and that's something I've imparted with my kids. They see dad read, they read. It's not a struggle. But I think two things that were formative to me were my grandmother gave me a book of Greek mythology when I was 9 or 10, which, I was like, this is amazing. These stories are incredible. And then the two Lewis Carroll books, right? Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. What happened there was I read the books, and then my dad sat me down. I had to have been 10, 11, I don't know, and told me that those stories actually had hidden meanings, right?
Mm-hmm.
That this was an allegory about the Queen of England. And that blew my mind, that you would have something on the surface, but then contextually it was a story about something else. And I'll never forget that, because that was the first book I ever read that it was explained to me, like, hey, there's more going on here than just a girl and a Cheshire cat and, this, that, and the other. And that just
Right.
really, really got me fired up. So.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. That's I love that. That's yeah. And I'm an avid reader too. So is there a book or it could be, I know there's so many different mediums, but I do love books. So let's stick with a book. Is there a book that you would recommend currently that you're reading or that you've read recently?
So I just finished up, it's actually hard sci-fi, and I'm not a sci-fi person at all, but the Three Body Problem trilogy,
Okay.
I just finished that. I devoured that series. Someone had recommended the first book to me, and like 20 pages in, I ordered the second and third ones on Amazon.
Okay.
And
And
like I
who's
said,
the author?
he's I don't know his
I'll look it
Chinese
up.
name. So he's
Yeah.
a Chinese author. So it's also translated into English. And
Okay.
like I said, it's hard sci-fi, which is not something I can't even believe it's coming out of my mouth right now. I'm not a sci-fi person, but
Right.
it spans the world building that this author creates, spanning over several hundred years, is just it was really amazing. I think recently either Amazon or Netflix is going to try to adapt it. I don't know how
Mm.
that's going to happen, but that's something I just found really profound and
Mm-hmm.
entertaining, which
Well,
you often
good.
don't get that intersection. So
Yeah, and I think that it sounds like a good read for the times we're in right now as
exactly,
well.
yeah.
Oh, well, good. Well, I'm definitely going to look that up, and I'll make sure on the show notes that I pull that down. Well, so speaking of being in different times, is there kind of a simple habit that you can share with us that you've adapted kind of in these recent times, just to, whether to keep your sanity or keep you, from getting to Zoom fatigued or whatever it is?
Yeah, it's been really hard, right? Like I
Right.
talked about a lot of this. So October 10th was World Mental Health Day. And I spoke around this topic because you're seeing people in my profession and in general burning out,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you're not used to working from home and now you work 24/7, and also there's a global pandemic, and your significant other and your children and your family are now all stuffed in a house, you're really
Mm-hmm.
seeing, it's concerning to me, the rate of burnout and mental health issues. So that being said, I think the first couple of months, honestly, we we were pretty active in our wine collection, which was probably not a
Guilt,
healthy coping
guilty is
mechanism.
charged right here too. Yes.
But I was reading this, my mom was telling me this article the other day that the average American's alcohol purchases have increased 10%. And I was like, man, I wish. So I think that was early on when we were just treating it kind of like what we
Like
do here.
we were pausing, right? Like things were
Yeah.
gonna, yeah.
So you have this term in Florida: when there's a hurricane coming, but it doesn't really come, you have a hurricane party. So
Mm-hmm.
it's just an excuse to eat a bunch of, junk food and drink too much and stay up late. And, so we all did that. But really for us, we've been fortunate, just like you were in Florida. So something that's kept our sanity is we're outside. We
Mm-hmm.
try to be outside a lot. And I'm
Yeah.
very thankful living in a warm weather climate. I can go outside every day of the year, just like you can. A lot of people can't.
Yeah.
They were shut in, and
Yeah.
we're starting to get into that time of year. So it's been physical activity, it's been being outside, and then it's just making sure we're connected with friends and family. Like we spoke to someone a couple of months ago, and they said, I don't think I've said a word in 2 weeks.
Oh
And
my
that was
goodness.
concerning, right? So we make
Yeah.
sure that we check in on people, that we talk to people, that we send them silly stuff in the mail. You got to do all these
Yeah.
things just to try to keep that connectivity, because I think that's something that is suffering right now with us all being Zoom and work from home.
Right.
Humans are social creatures, and
Yeah.
so what are you doing, that I get worried about, that social distancing becoming social isolation.
Mm-hmm.
So you've really got to push through that, do your Zoom happy hours or talk to people or see people when you can. So we've been trying to focus on that when we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it is I was reading a study that was talking about the increase in dementia and Alzheimer's for people because of the social isolation was kind of, they were talking about that was one of the big pieces in terms of the rise of deaths in that
Yeah.
segment of the population. Yeah, so important. So would you, uh, what's one word you would use to describe your professional journey?
Well, risk. I take risk. I've always taken risk, and I'm not afraid to throw things out when they're not working. So you and I had talked
Mm,
earlier,
yeah,
when I first got into this profession, I didn't know anything. I had this weighty job that I wasn't qualified for. So I leaned on, the academic structured side of things. So
hmm,
we had risk assessments and business impact analysis and recovery strategies and plans. You wanted binders. I had every binder because that's what I was told. Like, let's
right.
binder up. And then the Arab Spring happened, and we had a site in Cairo, and the Egyptian government fell. And
Mm,
I didn't have a total government collapse binder.
right,
And
right.
all that methodology that we had built doesn't apply. So it
Yeah,
all went right out the window. We were willing to take a risk that even though we had invested time and money and energy in something, it wasn't working. So drop it. And
right.
Malcolm Gladwell talks about that. He's very famous for saying, if you practice anything for 10,000 hours, you'll become an expert. But
Mm-hmm.
one of the subtexts he talks about is, if things aren't working, the quicker you identify and dump them, the more you can focus on the things that are working.
Right.
And I remember, just going into our boss's office like on day 2 and saying, hey, everything I've done for you, we're going to just flush, because it's not going to work.
Yeah,
And people's lives are in danger. And so I'm just going to admit that what I did was wrong, and let's move forward. So I was willing to take a risk and step out there and say, hey, this is wrong. This didn't work. What does work?
well, and
So
I would say that also shows tremendous humility.
yeah, I think, I try to teach that to my kids all the time, and it's something that's tough for them to understand, is if you make a mistake, just own it.
Just own it.
Because personally or professionally, when you don't, it becomes a bigger issue.
Oh,
And if you can really disarm someone by saying, hey, I blew that deadline, or hey, I did totally forget that call, or whatever. People get defensive. But, like you said at the start of this, nobody's perfect, nobody's infallible. Just, recognize and admit that mistake.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, what would be one word to describe your life? Either kind of the journey of your life or just even your life in this moment?
Hopefully fun. I love to have fun. So, like I learned, very early on, in my career in my 20s, I thought, okay, I was always the youngest person in the room. So I
Mm-hmm.
had to be the most professional and the most serious and the most put together, intelligent, whatever. And,
Right.
I got a lot of feedback from my wife and a lot of other people that like, you're intimidating. And
Mm-hmm.
that word cracks me up that anyone would ever think that of me. So I try to recognize, like you said, we all are still human.
Right.
So can you put some fun? Can you put some levity? Can you put even at times silliness into your workplace, your professional life? When I do webinars around the world now in risk management, I talk all the time about my cat. And my cat's become known as Walter the Risk Cat. And it's just a way to recognize we're all on Zoom in our house,
Right.
right? We're all
Right.
still people. So Walter has, I'm surprised he's not here now because he's like, oh, the camera's on. Let me hop in there and
Oh, that's
headbutt
great.
something. But, I think that frivolity, that silliness at times injects humanity back into our interactions.
For sure. Well, there's a great quote, which I keep threatening to actually memorize, but it's something to the effect of that you can be like, be serious about the work, but it doesn't mean that you have to be kind of serious about everything else, right? That
Yeah,
that when you do kind of good deep work, it allows for you to be, to be human and have some levity and, let the cat, be the star for a moment or whatever that is. I love that. I love that so much. So you we're pretty much wrapping up here. The one thing I would say is, what do you see in your experience working with all these different companies, different places? Is there kind of a common thing that employers or companies miss? What's that thing that, if you could just, if there was kind of that consistent thing that they seem to, that they miss on a regular basis, and when they're thinking about their organizations.
I think they miss how many superstars they have in their
Mm,
organization. And I see this time and time again. I come in as a consultant and I tell your CEO something that you've been telling your CEO. It's the exact same thing. And then they're like, James, that's a great idea. We should do that. And I've been on the other side of the table of that. And that's when I knew it was time to leave. I'm like, well, wait a minute. Why is the C-suite listening to this third party dude and not me? And there's so much hidden talent in organizations. And for
mhm,
some reason, we just tend to fast track or decide here's the people who are going to move up, and
mhm,
here's the people who are not. And unfortunately, sometimes it is along lines of race or sex or religion. But a
mhm.
lot of times, it's just companies thinking, well, James works in the mailroom,
Right.
so that's his upside. But you don't know people's stories. And companies tend to forget all the experience you had before you got hired in
Mhm.
there. So my encouragement would be you need to mine your existing employee base, because I guarantee you have superstars that you haven't identified. And they're gonna leave and go be a superstar
Right.
somewhere else.
Right. Well, that's one of my favorite things to do in a team training situation is ask everyone, what is something that's, kind of perceived as being outside of your job description that you would love to, get either some professional development around, or that you'd like to try your hand at, or, what's a skill that you have that's being overlooked.
Yeah.
And I think that is, as you said, because a lot of times we will hire, you know, for this, what we think, and people can just kind of get into this, oh, this is your lane. Um,
Exactly.
and then there can be bias at play too, whether it's conscious or unconscious. So yeah, definitely. Well, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you wish that I had?
So one story. So you're in Pasadena,
Yes.
right? Okay. So I have to tell you my Pasadena story. Growing up in the Midwest, right? The cold, brutal winters, a fan of the University of Michigan. My whole dream and my whole family's was, one day Michigan would go to the Rose Bowl. I think we watched the Rose Bowl parade more religiously than anything else
Oh my gosh,
on TV,
yeah.
because it was just so foreign to me as a young child to be in this brutal, cold, gray winter and
Right.
see the beauty that is Pasadena and the parade. And I'd still to this day, when I saw that you were from there, I got excited. I didn't even know why. It was like hardwired in my Michigan DNA. So I guess, one thing I would leave people with that, like, why is James even talking about that, is, you have these visions, these things you see, chase them.
Yeah.
Right? That was one of the reasons I moved to Florida. I wanted the palm trees in the yard. I wanted the pool. I wanted these things that I saw as a little kid with that parade. And, don't be afraid to take those risks. And sometimes you have to, I completely changed careers, right? We've moved the family, we've moved
Yeah.
around. Sometimes, if you want to chase that dream or that vision, you've got to take some of those risks.
Oh, absolutely. Well, thank you. That's an excellent last story. I love that. And I am, yes, I know I have several friends from the Midwest who have shared similar stories, who live in Southern California now. So
Exactly.
yes, I just to echo that, I would say when consistently the thing that I've seen is that people uh, they, and I don't mean this, they set their sights too low. Like I just say dream big and then dream even bigger. Um,
Exactly.
yeah. Well,
Exactly.
thank you so much and have a good rest of the day. And again, just such a pleasure having you on Learning to Swim.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Our goal is to inspire others and share stories to find meaning in your daily life. Let go of the traditional norms and be yourself at home, work, and beyond. The awareness of bright spots and blind spots is a performance enhancing tool that you can apply to your life and to your organization today.